As darkness falls on Halloween night, ancient whispers stir from the shadows, beckoning to those brave enough to uncover the chilling truth behind our most sinister holiday. Journey into the heart of Halloween's dark past, where human sacrifices once appeased vengeful spirits and restless souls haunt the very ground we walk on. Are you prepared to face the horrors that lurk just beyond the veil? Chapter 1. Celtic Beginnings, the Festival of Samhain. I arrived in Ireland on a gray, windswept morning, the kind of day where the sky hangs heavy with clouds that seem to press down on you. The air carried a chill that burrowed deep into my bones, as if the land itself remembered something ancient, something that lurked just beneath the surface. I was here to trace the origins of Halloween back to Samhain, the ancient Celtic festival that once marked the death of summer and the creeping advance of winter's darkness. My first stop was a small village in County Meath, not far from the Hill of Tara, a place steeped in myth and history. The locals here, like their ancestors before them, still spoke of Samhain in hushed tones, their words heavy with a respect that bordered on fear. The land felt alive with memories of rituals long past, memories that seemed ready to reach out from the soil and claim their due. At the local pub, I met with Aidan, a local historian who had agreed to talk about Samhain. He was a stout man with a rough beard, the kind you might expect to find tending sheep in the hills, not recounting tales of dark rituals. But as he spoke, his eyes gleamed with something deeper, something older. Samhain, he began, was not just the end of the harvest. It was the end of life itself, in a way. The Celts believed that on Samhain night, the veil between our world and the other world was thin. So thin you could step across it if you weren't careful. I shivered, not from the cold, but from the weight of his words. He went on to explain that during Samhain, spirits of the dead would walk among the living. They had to be appeased, Aidan continued. Bonfires were lit on the hills to guide them, but also to protect the living from the malevolent ones. You didn't want to anger them. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. There are records of sacrifices, animals, crops, and sometimes people. It was the way he said people that stuck with me. I wanted to dismiss it as an embellishment, but the truth is, history is littered with such sacrifices, and Ireland was no exception. I thanked Aidan and made my way to my next destination, the Hill of Ward, one of the most significant sites tied to Samhain. The Hill of Ward rose out of the landscape like a scar, a place where rituals had been performed for centuries. As I stood at the top, the wind howled around me, and I could almost hear the voices of those who had come before, gathering around towering bonfires that flickered against the pitch-black sky. The Celts believed these fires held the power to protect them from the restless spirits that wandered the earth on Samhain night. But there was another reason for the fires, one not often spoken of. Historical records from ancient Roman sources suggest that the fires may have been used for more than just guiding spirits. Human sacrifice, they claimed, was a key part of the ritual. The Druids, those mysterious priests of the Celts, were said to have offered the blood of the living to ensure the harvest would return and that the spirits would remain appeased for another year. Standing there, I could almost feel the weight of that history, as if the ground beneath my feet still carried the echoes of those dark ceremonies. It wasn't until I spoke with Dr. Kathleen Byrne, a folklore expert from Dublin, that I began to grasp the true depth of Samhain's horror. The Celts saw death not as an end, but as a passage, she explained. Samhain was the threshold between worlds, a time when the living and the dead could meet. But it was also dangerous. You had to make offerings to the spirits or risk their wrath. Dr. Byrne showed me several documented accounts from medieval texts where villages recorded their fear of Samhain night. One text described how entire communities would gather in terror, lighting fires and wearing disguises to fool the spirits. Masks of animal heads and skins were worn to blend in with the dead, to trick them into thinking they were one of their own. That's where the modern tradition of costumes comes from, Dr. Byrne said. But back then, it wasn't about fun. It was survival. The deeper I dug into Samhain's history, the more disturbing it became. The belief that the dead could return was more than just a myth. It was a lived reality for the Celts. They believed in the Aussie, ancient spirits or gods, who would emerge during Samhain to collect their due. If they weren't satisfied, crops would fail, livestock would die, and the people themselves would suffer. And it wasn't just animals that were sacrificed. I came across a particularly chilling story from a 19th century account of Samhain practices in rural Ireland. It told of a village that had suffered through a harsh winter, with crops failing and disease spreading. The villagers, desperate and afraid, believed they had angered the spirits by not offering enough. On the next Samhain, it was said that a young boy was chosen by lot, a willing sacrifice to restore balance. He was taken to the hills and given to the fire as an offering to the unseen forces that govern their world. The boy's name was lost to history, but the story remained, passed down in whispers. As I stood at the foot of the hill of Ward that night, with the wind howling and the sky darkening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something ancient was still here, watching. The rituals may have changed, but the fear, the reverence for the dead, remained. Bonfires, costumes, and offerings. These traditions we now celebrate with joy on Halloween night were born in terror, forged in blood. The Celts understood something that we've forgotten in our modern world. The dark half of the year brings with it more than just cold and long nights. It brings the dead, and sometimes they demand more than just our attention. Samhain was more than a festival. It was a reminder that the living and the dead were never as far apart as we like to believe. Chapter 2. Human sacrifice in the shadows of stone circles. The stone circles dotting the British Isles stand like sentinels, silent and unmoving, as if watching over ancient secrets long buried beneath the earth. They are relics of a time so distant, their true purpose has been lost to history. I set out to uncover what really happened within those shadowy rings, especially during Samhain, when the veil between the living and the dead was said to be thinnest. What I found disturbed me to my core. I began my investigation in the windswept plains of Wiltshire, home to the famous stone circle of Avebury. Larger and older than Stonehenge, Avebury is a place where history feels alive, pulsing beneath the soil. I had heard whispers of sacrifices performed here long ago, dark rituals designed to appease unseen forces. I needed answers, so I met with Dr. Fiona Marsh, an archaeologist who had spent years excavating sites around the area. "We've found bones," she said, her voice low and measured. "Human bones." The excavation had revealed skeletons buried in strange positions, as if the bodies had been deliberately posed. Some of the bones bore cuts and breaks that didn't match the natural decay of death. "There's evidence of trauma," Dr. Marsh explained. "Blows to the skull, deep cuts on the rib cages. These weren't just people who died of natural causes. They were offerings." I felt a cold shiver race down my spine. The thought that human beings, flesh and blood, just like me, were sacrificed at these stone circles centuries ago was unsettling enough. But as Dr. Marsh spoke, I realized there was more to this place than just the dead. There was something in the air, a heaviness, as though the stones themselves remembered the blood spilled in their shadows. That night, I walked the perimeter of the Avebury Circle, the wind howling through the stones. The moon hung low in the sky, casting eerie, shifting shadows across the ancient monoliths. I could almost hear voices, whispers carried on the wind. Legends from locals told of spirits that still haunted the circle, ghosts of those sacrificed here on cold Samhain nights. There were documented accounts, people who swore they'd seen figures in the fog, drifting between the stones, their faces pale and gaunt, as if caught between life and death. I couldn't sleep that night, haunted by the thought of those restless spirits. The next morning, I traveled to the north, to the remote Orkney Islands, where another stone circle awaited, the Ring of Brodger. Here, the landscape was even more desolate, the stones standing tall against the bleak, open sky. Brodger had long been associated with ancient rituals, its origins shrouded in mystery. I met with an old local historian named Angus MacLeod, a man whose family had lived on the island for generations. He greeted me with a knowing look, as though he understood why I had come before I even opened my mouth. "Samhain was different up here," he said, as we walked toward the circle. "The land is harsher, more isolated. People believed in the old ways longer than they did on the mainland. Angus spoke of legends passed down through his family, stories of sacrifices performed at the Ring of Brodger to ensure the return of the sun after the long, dark winter. It wasn't just animals, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. They gave people to the stones. He told me about an excavation near the site in the 1930s. Archaeologists uncovered fragments of human bone beneath one of the stones, bone that had been burned. The official reports suggested a ceremonial cremation, but Angus was convinced otherwise. They didn't just burn the dead here, they burned the living. There were stories of strange lights seen at the circle, flames that appeared and disappeared without warning. Angus himself had witnessed it as a child. It was Samhain, he recalled, his eyes distant, as if reliving the moment. We were out late, gathering firewood for the bonfires. I saw a light in the circle. It wasn't fire, not like any fire I've ever seen. It moved like it was alive. He paused, his voice trembling, and there was a figure standing in the middle of the stones. Just standing there, watching. But when I blinked, it was gone. His story was one of many I heard during my journey. Researchers and locals alike spoke of strange phenomena surrounding these ancient stone circles, lights in the night, ghostly apparitions, and a palpable sense of dread that clung to anyone who ventured too close. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting in the shadows of those stones. In my final days of investigation, I visited a lesser-known site in Dartmoor, a small stone circle hidden deep in the wilderness. This place was more forgotten than the others, its stones weathered and broken, but no less ominous. I met with another archaeologist, Professor Ellen Graves, who had recently conducted a dig at the site. We found something unexpected, she told me, as we stood by the stones, the sky darkening above us. A pit beneath the center of the circle, filled with charred remains. They weren't animals. Her team had uncovered what appeared to be the remains of ritual sacrifices, dating back to the early Iron Age. The bones showed signs of violent death, blunt force trauma, deep lacerations. These people were killed here, she said grimly, and then burned in the circle. It's possible they were offerings to the gods or spirits. We may never know for sure, but the most chilling discovery came from the reports of the excavation team. Several members claimed to have seen figures near the stones at dusk, figures that disappeared when approached. One even reported hearing voices in an unknown language, whispering from the shadows. None of them could explain what they had seen, but they all felt the same creeping sense of unease, as if they were being watched. Standing there in the gathering darkness, surrounded by those ancient stones, I couldn't help but feel it too. The stones had witnessed something dark, something terrifying. The earth beneath them had soaked in the blood of the living, and their spirits lingered, bound to the land by the violence done to them. As I left the circle, the wind picked up, carrying with it the distant sound of something I couldn't quite place. It might have been the wind, or it might have been something else. Something older, something still hungry. The stone circles remain, silent and unmoving. But the echoes of what happened within their shadows continue to haunt those who dare to look too closely. And I, after what I had seen and heard, knew that some things were better left buried in the dark earth beneath those stones. Chapter 3: Druids and the Occult, Masters of Dark Magic. I had heard whispers of the Druids long before I began this investigation. Even now, the name evokes a kind of primal dread, an image of shadowy figures clad in robes, presiding over ancient rites in the dead of night, their faces hidden behind masks of wood and bone. As I delved deeper into the occult origins of Halloween, it became clear that to understand the holiday's dark roots, I needed to follow the trail of the Druids, the mysterious priesthood of the Celts, known for their mastery of magic, nature, and blood sacrifice. I started with the few records that exist about them. The Romans, who saw the Druids as a threat to their control over the British Isles, documented their practices with a mixture of horror and fascination. According to these ancient accounts, the Druids held power not just over the people, but over the natural world itself. They were said to be able to summon storms, control the elements, and even communicate with the dead. The most chilling accounts, however, came from Julius Caesar himself. who wrote of druidic rituals involving human sacrifice. In his Commentary de Bello Gallico, Caesar described how the Druids would build massive wicker effigies, fill them with live human victims, and set them ablaze as offerings to their gods. The purpose of these sacrifices was twofold: to ensure the favor of the gods and to tap into the forces of the underworld. I traveled to Anglesey, an island off the coast of Wales, once a stronghold of druidic power. The landscape here was rugged, windswept, and isolated, as though the island had been forgotten by time. It was here that the Romans launched a brutal campaign to wipe out the Druids in the 1st century AD, but the land still felt thick with their presence, as if their spirits lingered, waiting in the shadows of the ancient oak groves that dotted the island. I met with Dr. Rhys Owen, a historian who had spent his career studying the Druids. He agreed to guide me through some of the lesser-known sites on the island, places where the Druids had once performed their most secretive rituals. As we walked through a dense forest, the trees towering above us, blocking out the sun, Dr. Owen explained that the Druids believed certain places held immense power, especially groves of oak trees. They considered oak trees sacred, he said, his voice barely a whisper in the oppressive silence of the woods. They believed the trees were a gateway between the worlds, the living and the dead, the natural and the supernatural. He stopped abruptly in a small clearing, where the ground sloped down into a hollow, barely visible through the overgrown brush. This, he said, was once a druidic ritual site. We know from Roman accounts that the Druids conducted sacrifices here, deep in the forest, away from prying eyes. The air was thick with an almost tangible sense of dread. I could imagine the Druids standing here, chanting in a language long lost to time, as the flames of their fires licked the sky. I could hear the screams of their victims, bound and helpless, as they were offered to whatever dark forces the Druids sought to control. Dr. Owen told me of an excavation in the 1970s, where archaeologists uncovered evidence of ritualistic practices. Animal bones were found, broken and burned, alongside fragments of human remains. The arrangement of the bones suggested they had been carefully placed, perhaps as part of some elaborate ceremony. But there was more, something the archaeologists had chosen to leave out of their official reports. A few of the workers reported seeing things, Dr. Owen said, his voice low. Figures in the trees, shadows that moved where there shouldn't have been any. One man swore he saw a woman standing at the edge of the clearing, dressed in robes, watching them. But when he called out, she vanished. I felt a chill creep down my spine. The thought that the Druids might still be here, their spirits guarding these ancient sites, sent a jolt of fear through me. But it wasn't until I visited the ruins of an old Roman fort nearby that I truly understood the dark power the Druids were believed to possess. The Romans, terrified by the Druids' magic and their control over the Celtic tribes, had taken drastic measures to eradicate them. One of the most disturbing pieces of evidence came from a Roman historian named Tacitus, who described the final battle between the Romans and the Druids on Anglesey. The Druids, knowing they were outnumbered, performed one last ritual before the fight began. They called upon the spirits of the dead and the forces of the underworld to aid them in battle. Tacitus wrote of Roman soldiers freezing in place, paralyzed with terror, as the Druids stood on the shore, raising their arms to the sky, chanting in a strange, guttural language. The soldiers claimed to have seen apparitions rise from the ground, figures made of shadow and flame, screaming with the voices of the damned. The battle was a slaughter, and though the Romans ultimately won, they were left haunted by the sight of the Druids' dark magic. Back in my hotel room that night, I pored over the writings of early Christian monks who had later encountered the remnants of Druidic culture. These monks, horrified by what they saw, recorded stories of Druidic ceremonies that had survived in secret for centuries. One such account from the 9th century described a group of Druids performing a Samhain ritual in a hidden cave. The monks wrote of how the Druids sacrificed both animals and humans to summon demons from the underworld, believing that the demons would grant them the power to see into the future. The descriptions were vivid and terrifying. Blood running down the walls of the cave, the air thick with the smell of burning flesh, and the earth shaking as something ancient and evil stirred beneath their feet. The monks also claimed to have witnessed strange phenomena, lights in the sky, ghostly apparitions, and unearthly sounds that echoed through the hills at night. They believed that the Druids had opened a door between worlds, allowing something dark and dangerous to slip through. And though the monks tried to banish these forces with prayers and holy water, the evil never truly left. As I closed the old book, the shadows in my room seemed to lengthen, stretching toward me as if in warning. The Druids, masters of dark magic, had tapped into forces we can barely comprehend. And though their rituals had been performed centuries ago, I couldn't shake the feeling that their power still lingered in the land, waiting for someone to unlock it once again. Chapter 4: Christianity's Struggle and the Transformation of Halloween. Europe in the Dark Ages was a land steeped in fear and mystery. The forests were dense and uncharted, the nights long and unforgiving. Superstitions thrived here, where the shadows held ancient terrors, and the line between life and death seemed to blur on the coldest, darkest nights. It was in these lands that the forces of Christianity and the pagan traditions of Samhain collided, and in that struggle, Halloween, as we know it today, began to take shape. I traveled to the heart of France, a country where the early church waged one of its fiercest battles against the old ways. In the medieval town of Rouen, nestled beside the River Seine, I met with Father Guillaume, a historian and priest whose knowledge of the early church's efforts to eradicate paganism was unmatched. His small office, tucked away in the basement of a centuries-old cathedral, was cluttered with ancient books and crumbling manuscripts, the scent of dust and age hanging heavy in the air. The church saw Samhain as a direct affront to the teachings of Christ. Father Guillaume began, his voice solemn. The early missionaries who arrived here in the 7th and 8th centuries were horrified by what they found. He handed me a thick manuscript, its pages yellowed with time. This was the account of Bishop St. Boniface, a missionary sent by Pope Gregory II to convert the pagans of what is now Germany. Boniface described rituals he had witnessed, rituals that chilled me as I read his words. He spoke of the people's belief that on Samhain, the dead returned to the world of the living. To appease these spirits, they lit bonfires, made offerings of food, and in some cases performed blood sacrifices. It wasn't just animals, Father Guillaume said, his face grim as he watched me absorb the text. There are reports, though less frequent, of human sacrifices continuing even after the church had established itself in these regions. Boniface's writings echoed this, though in veiled language. He described how certain villages, remote and isolated, resisted the church's teachings and continued to hold onto their ancient traditions. These rituals, he wrote, were performed in secret, deep in the forests, far from the prying eyes of the church. They worship the spirits of the dead and demons, believing that these sacrifices will protect them from evil, he wrote. The church, seeing the persistence of these rituals as a threat, declared war on Samhain. In 835 AD, Pope Gregory IV moved to co-opt the holiday, establishing All Hallows' Day on November 1st, a day to honor the saints and martyrs. The night before, October 31st, became All Hallows' Eve, a holy vigil meant to cleanse the pagan celebrations that marked the changing of the seasons. But the transformation wasn't immediate. The old ways ran deep in the people, and the church's efforts to suppress them were met with resistance. Bonfires still burned in the hills on Samhain night, and villagers still left offerings for the wandering spirits. The church responded with force. Accounts from the time tell of priests ordering the destruction of pagan altars, the burning of sacred groves, and even the execution of those accused of witchcraft or devil worship. I followed this trail of conflict to Ireland, where the church's struggle against Samhain was perhaps the most intense. In the town of Clonmacnoise, I met with Brother Aidan, a Benedictine monk who had studied the early Christianization of Ireland. He took me to the ruins of an old monastery, where ancient gravestones marked the resting places of long-forgotten monks who had fought to convert the local population. There are stories, Brother Aidan said as we walked through the overgrown graveyard, that even here, within the walls of the monastery, the monks could not fully escape the old ways. He led me to a small chapel, now little more than a crumbling stone shell. Inside, the air was thick with an oppressive silence, as though the land itself held its breath. Brother Aidan pointed to a spot on the floor where, centuries ago, a monk had reportedly witnessed something unholy. Father Finian, Aidan explained, claimed to have seen a shadow pass through this very room on the eve of Samhain. He described it as a figure, cloaked in black, with no face, only darkness where its features should have been. The monk had been so shaken by the encounter that he had written about it in his journal, a document still preserved in the monastery's archives. I read the entry later that evening, and it was clear that Father Finian believed the figure he saw was not of this world. He wrote of feeling a cold presence, a sense of dread that chilled him to the bone, and a certainty that what he had seen was a manifestation of the spirits the local villagers had been trying to appease through their secret rites. Despite the church's growing influence, Samhain refused to die. The rituals persisted, sometimes hidden in plain sight. In some places, the church compromised, allowing certain elements of the old ways to continue under the guise of Christian practice. The bonfires, for example, became a symbol of light triumphing over darkness, rather than offerings to the spirits. But the truth was harder to bury. The people still believed that on Samhain night, the dead walked among them, and no amount of preaching could fully convince them otherwise. I traveled next to Scotland, where one of the most disturbing stories emerged. In the remote village of Orkney, I spoke with Margaret Gunn, a local historian who had uncovered an old church document detailing a confrontation between a group of Christian missionaries and a pagan coven that still practiced Samhain rituals. In the early 12th century, Margaret said, a group of monks arrived here to bring the word of Christ to the Northern Isles. They found that many of the villagers still celebrated Samhain in secret, despite the church's efforts to Christianize the holiday. The monks attempted to put an end to the celebrations, but they were met with resistance. According to the document, the coven performed a ritual on the night of Samhain, one that was said to summon dark forces. The next morning, the monks were found dead, their bodies twisted and broken, as if they had been thrown from great heights. The villagers claimed the deaths were the work of demons, summoned by the coven to protect their ancient practices. Margaret showed me a portion of the manuscript, written in Latin by one of the surviving monks. It described a terrifying scene. Fires burning in the hills, strange figures dancing in the shadows, and a sense of overwhelming evil that descended upon the village that night. The church, undeterred, continued its campaign to transform Samhain into a Christian holiday. But even as All Hallows' Eve took root, the old ways never truly disappeared. They lived on in secret, in whispered stories passed down through generations, in the flicker of firelight on a cold October night, and in the sense of something watching, just beyond the edge of the fire's glow. As I left Orkney, I couldn't shake the feeling that those ancient forces, summoned by the Druids, fought by the church, were still out there, waiting in the darkness. Chapter 5. The Witch Hunts, Paganism's Hidden Survival. Salem was my first stop. The town has long since embraced its dark history, but beneath the tourist traps and plastic broomsticks, the shadows of 1692 still linger. I felt at the moment I arrived, an unsettling quiet hanging in the air, as if the land itself remembered the terror that had gripped this place centuries ago. I was here to investigate the chilling connection between Halloween and witchcraft, a link forged in blood and superstition, with roots that stretched back to the ancient pagan rites the church had sought to destroy. I started with the trial records, the original documents, preserved in a small, climate-controlled room in the Peabody Essex Museum, were brittle with age, their ink faded but still legible. The names on these pages were more than just historical footnotes. They were real people accused of witchcraft, whose lives had been torn apart by fear and paranoia. One name stood out to me: Bridget Bishop, the first woman to be executed during the Salem witch trials. I had read about her before, but seeing her name on the original court record sent a shiver down my spine. She was accused of consorting with the devil, of casting spells to torment her neighbors, and of participating in rituals that had more in common with the ancient practices of Samhain than the puritanical Christianity of colonial New England. What struck me most was the testimony of her accusers. They described seeing her spectral form at night, appearing in their homes, tormenting them with strange visions. One neighbor claimed she had seen Bishop dancing in the woods under the light of a full moon, her hands raised in a gesture of invocation. The image was haunting, so similar to the ancient rites I had read about during my research into Samhain. Was it possible that the fear of witchcraft in Salem was, in some way, an echo of those ancient pagan practices? I needed to go deeper. From Salem, I crossed the Atlantic to Europe, where the witch hunts had begun long before the hysteria reached the New World. I arrived in the town of Trier, Germany, where one of the largest and most brutal witch hunts in history took place during the late 16th century. Here, hundreds of men and women were tortured and executed, accused of practicing witchcraft and making pacts with the devil. I met with Professor Carl Newman, an expert on European witch hunts, who agreed to show me the archives. The records we uncovered were harrowing. One particularly chilling confession came from an accused witch named Katarina Hennet, a wealthy woman who was well respected in her community before being dragged into the witch trials. Under torture, she admitted to flying to the Brocken, a mountain in Germany long associated with witchcraft, to attend a witch's Sabbath. There, she claimed she had made a pact with the devil, offering him her soul in exchange for power. The details of her confession were eerily similar to the rites practiced during Samhain. According to Hennet, the witches gathered around a large bonfire, chanting in an ancient language, invoking spirits and demons to aid them in their magic. They performed sacrifices, usually small animals, though in some cases, human blood was spilled. It was as if the old pagan rituals, long thought extinguished by the church, had survived in secret, hidden beneath layers of superstition and fear. As I read through the accounts, a pattern began to emerge. The confessions of the accused witches, whether in Salem or in Europe, often included references to gatherings in the wilderness, under the cover of darkness, where they performed rituals to summon spirits and gain power from otherworldly forces. These rituals bore a striking resemblance to the ancient Samhain traditions, where the veil between the living and the dead was believed to be thinnest, and where contact with the spirit world was not only possible, but necessary for survival. One confession from an English witch, Agnes Sampson, stood out in particular. In 1590, she was accused of summoning storms to sink the fleet of King James VI of Scotland, who later became James I of England. During her trial, she described how she and other witches had gathered on All Hallows' Eve to perform a ceremony. They lit fires, danced in a circle, and invoked spirits to do their bidding. Her description was almost identical to the ancient Samhain rites that had been practiced in secret for centuries. But what chilled me most was what she said next. Sampson claimed that during the ritual, a dark figure had appeared to them, a being that she referred to as the Black Man. He had come to them from the shadows, offering them power in exchange for their loyalty. It was the devil himself, she said, and he had promised them protection if they followed his commands. The Black Man. This was a figure that appeared again and again in the confessions of accused witches. Whether in Europe or New England, the accused spoke of meeting a dark figure, often in the form of a man, who offered them knowledge and power in exchange for their souls. This figure was, of course, identified as the devil by the church, but I couldn't help but wonder if he was something older, some remnant of the ancient gods worshipped by the Celts during Samhain. These confessions, often extracted under torture, painted a disturbing picture of how Halloween became associated with witchcraft. But it wasn't just the accused who spoke of these rituals. I found numerous accounts from witnesses who claimed to have seen witches flying on broomsticks, attending Sabbaths in the woods, and casting curses on their enemies. These testimonies, while often fantastical, were taken seriously by the authorities at the time, and they fueled the witch hunts that claimed thousands of lives across Europe and the Americas. The confessions, whether real or coerced, revealed a world where the line between the natural and supernatural had been blurred. Halloween, with its roots in Samhain, became a night where the dark forces of the old world could rise again, if only for a few hours. The witches, whether guilty or innocent, were seen as the last practitioners of these ancient rites, and they were hunted down with a ferocity that still haunts the modern imagination. Chapter 6: Modern Halloween. Dark Rituals in Plain Sight. It was Halloween night in rural Pennsylvania when the first story crossed my desk. The year was 1979, and what started as a typical evening of trick-or-treating ended with a gruesome discovery. A local farmer, John Simmons, stumbled upon a macabre scene in the woods near his property. A circle of candles, animal bones arranged in patterns, and the mutilated body of a goat at the center, its blood still fresh. It wasn't long before rumors of occult activity spread through the small town, whispers of Satanists using Halloween night as a veil for their dark rituals. That was where my investigation began, with old police reports and faded news clippings documenting what would become known as the Bloody Halloween case. The authorities at the time chalked it up to teenage pranks gone wrong, but the details nagged at me. The precise arrangement of the bones, the specific symbols carved into the trees, it felt too deliberate, too ritualistic to be the work of mere vandals. And as I dug deeper, I began to uncover similar stories from across the country, accounts of Halloween night becoming a stage for something far darker than haunted houses and costume parties. My next stop was Detroit, a city with its own Halloween horrors. Every year, from the late 1970s to the early 1990s, the city was plagued by Devil's Night, a violent tradition where arsonists set fire to hundreds of abandoned buildings on the eve of Halloween. While the media focused on the flames, I found reports buried in police archives of even more sinister activities occurring in the shadows of those burning structures. In 1985, a firefighter responding to a call on Devil's Night stumbled upon a strange ritual in the basement of a derelict building. The group scattered before he could see their faces, but the evidence left behind told a chilling story: black candles, cryptic symbols drawn in ash, and the remains of small animals, sacrificed to whatever dark forces they had been trying to summon. I tracked down one of the detectives who worked the case, now retired, but still haunted by what he had seen. Over a cup of black coffee in a dimly lit diner, he recounted the night in vivid detail. There was something off about the whole thing, he said, his voice low. It wasn't just a gang or some bored kids playing with fire. There was intent behind it, like they were trying to open a door to someplace they shouldn't be messing with. He showed me photos from the scene, grainy, black and white images of symbols I recognized from my earlier research into ancient Samhain rites. It was a stark reminder that Halloween, even in the modern world, still carried the weight of its pagan roots. The veil between worlds was thin on this night, and it seemed that some were still trying to cross it. But it wasn't just in the crumbling cities and forgotten rural towns where these rituals took place. As I continued my investigation, I found reports from the suburbs, quiet, seemingly safe neighborhoods, where the darkness had crept in unnoticed. In 1994, a chilling case from Ohio made national headlines when a young boy, dressed as a skeleton for Halloween, disappeared during a neighborhood party. His body was found days later in the woods, surrounded by signs of a ritualistic sacrifice. The local police were quick to dismiss the idea of occult involvement, despite the strange symbols carved into the boy's skin and the arrangement of bones found nearby. To this day, the case remains unsolved, a painful reminder of how ancient evils can still touch the lives of the innocent. In an attempt to separate fact from fiction, I interviewed several investigators who had worked on similar cases throughout the 20th century. Many were reluctant to speak openly, either out of fear of ridicule or concern for their own safety. But one retired officer from Los Angeles, who asked to remain anonymous, gave me a glimpse into the darker side of Halloween in the City of Angels. He had been part of an undercover task force in the early 1980s, investigating a string of disappearances linked to a cult that called themselves the Children of Solid. They weren't just playing dress up, he told me. These people were serious. They believed that Halloween was their night, the one night of the year when they could commune with whatever dark forces they worshipped. We raided a house on Halloween night, 1982, and found what can only be described as a sacrificial altar. There were animal remains, symbols drawn in blood, and in the corner, a pit full of dirt where they had buried something or someone. We never did find out. The cult members, arrested and questioned, offered little in the way of explanation. To them, Halloween wasn't just a holiday, It was a sacred night, one that had been twisted and watered down by society, but still held immense power for those who knew how to harness it. The detective's words stuck with me. Halloween has always been about death and the supernatural. It's just that most people have forgotten. From the wild streets of Los Angeles, I traveled to New Orleans, a city where the dead walk in plain sight. Here, Halloween is more than just a party, it's a spiritual experience. Voodoo rituals, steeped in the belief that the dead can be contacted on All Hallows Eve, take place in secret, away from the drunken revelers in the French Quarter. I met with a voodoo priestess, who agreed to speak with me on the condition that her identity remain hidden. She described the rituals performed on Halloween night, when the barriers between the living and the dead were weakest. The spirits are closer on that night, she whispered. We honor them, but there are others who seek to control them. Not everyone who practices is doing it for good. Her words echoed in my mind as I pieced together the stories I had uncovered. The accounts of modern-day cults and dark rituals on Halloween night were too numerous to dismiss as coincidence. In 1999, in the forests of upstate New York, police discovered a gruesome scene. A group of teenagers had been killed in what investigators described as a ritualistic slaying. The media spun it as a tragic result of teenage rebellion gone wrong. But the symbols carved into the trees told a different story, one that harkened back to ancient rites designed to summon dark forces. As I pored over police reports, news clippings, and interviews with investigators, the pattern became clear. Halloween, for all its candy and costumes, still retained an undercurrent of danger, a connection to the ancient rituals of Samhain that refused to die. Behind the masks, beneath the laughter, there were those who used the night to indulge in the same dark rites that had once terrified our ancestors. Cult gatherings, ritual killings, sacrifices, they were all happening, hidden in plain sight, wrapped in the guise of harmless fun. I ended my investigation in a small, unassuming town in the Midwest, where a series of strange disappearances had gone largely unnoticed by the rest of the world. The local sheriff, a man worn down by years of unexplainable incidents, gave me a tour of the area where the most recent disappearance had occurred. It was a quiet, wooded stretch of land, just off the main road, where a local teenager had vanished on Halloween night. No traces were ever found, but the sheriff pointed out a peculiar detail. Every year on Halloween, we find these symbols carved into the trees. We've never been able to make sense of them, but they're always there. I recognized the symbols immediately. They were the same ancient markings used in the Samhain rites I had studied, symbols of sacrifice and summoning. As I stood there, the cold October wind biting at my skin, I couldn't shake the feeling that, even now, in the 21st century, Halloween remained a night where the boundaries between this world and the next could be crossed, where the old gods still whispered, and dark rituals continued in plain sight. Chapter 7. Haunted by the past, ghosts, spirits, and the unquiet dead. I've always been skeptical when it comes to ghost stories, but there's something about Halloween, something about this night when the veil between the living and the dead is at its thinnest that makes even a cynic like me hesitate. I've traveled across the world tracing the dark history of Halloween, from ancient Samhain rituals to modern-day cult activities, but what haunts me most are the stories of restless spirits, the unquiet dead who refuse to move on. It was a chilly October night when I found myself in the small, windswept village of Glastonbury, England. Known for its mysticism and pagan history, Glastonbury has long been rumored to be a hotspot for paranormal activity. I was here to meet with Alice, a local historian who had experienced something unexplainable while investigating the ancient burial grounds just outside the village. The burial site, known to date back to the time of the Celts, was believed to have been used for Samhain rituals, including human sacrifices. Alice met me at the edge of the burial mound, a lone figure standing in the mist. Her face was pale and drawn, as though the land itself had drained the color from her. She didn't waste any time with pleasantries. Instead, she led me directly to the spot where she'd had her encounter. It was 3 years ago, on Halloween night, she began, her voice barely more than a whisper. I was here alone, taking photographs for a research project. I had just finished when I heard something, footsteps, but there was no one around. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the leaves, but then I felt it. She paused, her eyes scanning the fog-drenched landscape as if reliving the moment. There was this presence. I can't describe it. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. And then I saw it, a figure standing near the old oak tree, dressed in what looked like ancient robes. I tried to move, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot. The figure raised its arm, and I swear I heard a voice in my head. It wasn't English, but I understood it. It was a warning, a curse, maybe. It said, "The dead do not rest." And then it was gone. Her account sent a chill down my spine. Alice wasn't the type to exaggerate, and she certainly didn't strike me as someone prone to flights of fancy. But what she described was eerily similar to other encounters I had read about during my research, accounts of spirits tied to ancient sacrificial sites, unable to move on, their energy trapped in the land where they had been offered to the gods. From Glastonbury, I traveled to Scotland, where the infamous Greyfriars Kirkyard in Edinburgh is home to one of the most documented hauntings in history. The cemetery, with its crooked tombstones and ancient mausoleums, has been the site of countless ghost sightings, especially around Halloween. Legend has it that the graveyard is cursed, haunted by the vengeful spirit of Sir George Mackenzie, a brutal 17th century judge who sentenced hundreds of accused witches to their deaths. I met with David, a paranormal investigator who had been studying the hauntings at Greyfriars for over a decade. We stood by the infamous Mackenzie poltergeist tomb, a towering stone structure that loomed over us like a monument to death itself. David told me of the strange phenomena that had been recorded here: cold spots, inexplicable scratches appearing on visitors, and even sightings of Mackenzie's ghost roaming the cemetery grounds on Halloween night. "We've captured some pretty compelling evidence over the years," David said, showing me a series of photos taken during previous investigations. In one, a translucent figure could be seen hovering near the entrance of Mackenzie's mausoleum. Another photo showed strange orbs of light floating above the graves, lights that hadn't been visible to the naked eye. But it wasn't just the photographs that unnerved me. David recounted several first-hand experiences from people who had encountered the poltergeist. One story, in particular, stuck with me. A young woman visiting the cemetery on Halloween night in 2004 had felt a sharp pain in her chest while walking past Mackenzie's tomb. When she looked down, 3 scratch marks had appeared on her skin, as if some unseen force had clawed at her. She left the cemetery in a panic, but the scratches persisted for days, refusing to heal. She was never the same after that night, David said grimly. Whatever it was that touched her left a mark on more than just her skin. From the windswept graves of Scotland to the haunted lands of America, my investigation next led me to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the site of one of the bloodiest battles of the American Civil War. Gettysburg is steeped in tragedy and death. Over 50,000 soldiers died during those 3 days of battle, and it is said that their spirits still roam the fields, unable to find peace. Halloween in Gettysburg is a time when the veil is thought to be especially thin, and many locals claim to have seen ghostly apparitions wandering the battlefields. I met with Thomas, a former park ranger turned ghost hunter, who had seen his fair share of paranormal activity during his years working at the national park. "It's not just one night," Thomas told me as we walked through the fog-covered fields at dusk. "These spirits are here year-round, but there's something about Halloween. It's like they get restless. I've seen full-bodied apparitions, soldiers in uniform, marching across the field. They vanish as quickly as they appear, but you can feel them. The air gets colder, and there's this weight, like something's watching you." He took me to a spot near Devil's Den, a rocky outcrop where some of the fiercest fighting took place. As we stood there in the twilight, Thomas shared the story of a group of tourists who had visited the site on Halloween night a few years ago. They had been taking photos when they noticed something strange: a soldier standing among the rocks, his face pale and bloodied. At first, they thought it was a reenactor, but when they approached him, he disappeared into thin air. "I've seen those photos," Thomas said. "It wasn't a trick of the light. There was something there." As night fell, I felt the oppressive weight of the land's history pressing down on me. It wasn't hard to believe that the spirits of the dead still lingered here, tied to the place where they had died so violently. In my final stop, I traveled to the small town of Stull, Kansas, home to one of the most notorious paranormal legends in America. Stull Cemetery has long been rumored to be one of the 7 gateways to hell, a place where the devil himself is said to appear on Halloween night. The town's residents are tight-lipped about the cemetery's dark reputation, but I managed to speak with a local named Jacob, who had a story that sent a chill through me. "It was Halloween years ago," Jacob began, his voice low and hesitant. "A group of us decided to visit the cemetery after hearing the stories. It was just supposed to be a bit of fun, you know? But when we got there, I don't know how to explain it. There was this cold wind, and everything went silent. No crickets, no birds, nothing. We saw this shadow, a figure, standing near one of the gravestones. And then it was like the air got thicker, like something didn't want us there. We ran. I've never been back since." Jacob's experience was far from unique. Many visitors to Stull Cemetery have reported similar encounters: strange figures, eerie sounds, and an overwhelming sense of dread. Whether or not the cemetery is truly a gateway to hell remains up for debate, but one thing is clear: the spirits of Halloween may still walk among us, haunting the places where blood was spilled and sacrifices were made. As we draw the curtain on this journey through Halloween's dark history, I invite you to share your own stories and experiences. Have you ever felt the chilling presence of a spirit or encountered something inexplicable on this haunted night? Your tales are vital to keeping the dialogue alive about the mysteries that linger in the shadows. Please comment and share your experiences. Together, we can unearth the secrets that Halloween holds, one chilling story at a time.